our Glee backend is structured to work very well with the architectural strategy that is called domain-driven design. And I'm going to walk through that structure here in this video. I'm going to start with the domain because in the domain-driven design, the domain is the core of the application, and everything else radiates out from the domain. So in the domain, we have, I'll just show you the dependencies. In the domain, we have almost no dependencies at all. We can look and see, there is AutoMapper. It does depend on common, so there's a link back to common. But outside of that, I'm not even sure that we even need this analyzer. I'm not sure what that is even. It does have some packages from outside, Fluent validation, and I'm really thinking we can remove this one. I'm not sure though. I will have to see. But the idea is that the domain is very clean. It doesn't take dependencies on other layers in the application. When I say layers, I'm talking about if you think of a layered cake, the domain is on the bottom of that layered cake, and then other layers are sitting on top of that. So in my book, the common layer here is very similar to the domain layer. It's on the same level basically. In fact, the things from the common layer could even be moved into the domain layer without hurting anything. So looking at the folders, as you're creating new commands, the commands themselves should go right here in this commands folder. And then the handlers for those commands should go in the folder called handlers. The names of those should be very similar. They should map kind of one-to-one back to the commands. Same thing with the validators. It's just that you have to have a one-to-one relationship between commands and handlers, because if you try to dispatch a command that doesn't have a handler, you will get an exception. But validators are optional. If you create a validator for a command, it will get validated. If you don't, then it will just not even pass through that stage. So you can see here that whoever created this is subfoldering this to help keep things a little bit more separated and organized, and that's just fine. This is for validating the create name employee, or I can't even read. Validate change employee names, and so that is right here in the base folder, or if you'd like, you can do subfolders. Either way is fine. So that's the commands folder. I'll skip to the events folders because it's very similar. Here you have the events here, and you have their handlers. Now, unlike commands, you can actually have events without handlers. When it tries to dispatch an event that doesn't have a handler, it just stops there. It doesn't throw an exception. It doesn't complain. It just keeps on going. So that's the events folder. Now we can move into entities. Now entities right now is very simple. There's not a lot going on because this is a sample project, and we have our employee entity that we use for all of our demonstrations. This folder, as your project grows, this folder will likely get larger, but it should only have entities or aggregate roots, depending on which word you're using in your project. This employee is an aggregate, and it is which is a type of entity, so it is living in the entity folder. So don't allow other things to creep into this folder. Just let these be entities or aggregates. So our repositories folder is it really only has 2 files in it, and I imagine that this should only be for the life of your project. You may only ever have these 2 things in this folder, and you notice here that these are not the concrete repositories. That's happening in another layer. For the domain, all we want is the abstract version, the contract that we are operating by. So you can see here that these 2 interfaces they don't carry an implementation with them. They just carry the signature of what is expected. And then in services, This is where we're going to have some interfaces that define the contracts, and then also maybe some implementations. If the implementation doesn't depend on an external service, then you can have the implementation right here in the domain layer. If not, just put the interface in the domain layer, and then you can put the implementation in another layer. So this one, as you can see, it's not going out to an external service to get this GUID. It's just going to it's just GUID.new GUID, and that's it. So that's totally fine to have in the domain layer. Let's see if I left anything out. Nope, that's pretty much it. These folders really should encompass all of the things you would want in a domain layer. If you're getting much outside of these areas and wanting to put it in the domain layer, just start a conversation with your team. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, and maybe we can come up with a better solution. So then let's go up to the next layer in our layered cake, which is the data layer. So in the data layer, we are going to have our migrations. Migrations are either generated by .Net, or they are written by us by hand. Either way, they should be right here in this migrations folder. Now you're going to notice that they have this designer file, which is not something that we have to be concerned with. It is something that is maintained by .Net itself. So we can usually just ignore that, keep that closed. And also this app data context model snapshot is something that is generated by .NET. We can just ignore it, leave that in the migrations folder. And of course, here we have a folder for repositories. So as you noticed in the domain layer, we have only interfaces. In the data layer, we have the actual implementations of those repositories. We've got a read-only repository, we've got a writable repository. And these things are unabashedly using, going out to third-party things, going out to the database. These things are traditionally much harder to test. You have to pretty much do an integration test to test these things. And so that they're in the data layer because they don't really fit into the model of what we want in the domain layer. So these two folders, migrations and repositories, this pretty much all has to do, and then the data context itself, which is the entity framework data DB context. All these things have to do with database, and you might be led to think that the only thing in the data layer should be database related, but it could actually go outside of that definition if you'd like. The maybe even a better name for this layer is the implementation layer. The interfaces should definitely belong in the domain unless they are very specific to like data or third-party kind of interfaces. But the implementation of those interfaces could go into this data layer very easily. You could have all kinds of things in the data layer. You could also create multiple layers, data layer type things. You could, if you're doing a lot of interface with Facebook, for instance, or lots of different social media platforms, and you're doing back-end work with them, you might create another project in your solution and maybe call it the Facebook data layer, or who knows. But that could be where you are implementing those domain layer interfaces. Or you can just put them in a folder in the existing data layer. I think either way is pretty good, and that should just be a conversation that you start with your team. But you can definitely think of the data layer as the implementation layer. So I've got data layer, domain layer, and then the third layer of our cake is the web layer. So the web layer, another name for the web layer is the presentation layer. Presentation layer in any project is where you're actually touching the outside world. You're interfacing with the outside world. So everything needs to culminate in the web layer. which is the reason why we have an infrastructure folder that does all the bootstrapping. We go out to these other layers and scan them for interfaces and concrete classes and implementations. We have just a lot of code in the web layer that is meant to really tie everything together. So if you notice here in the dependencies, we'll look at the projects. You'll notice that the web layer has a link to the data layer and the domain layer. We'll go back to the data layer and we'll notice that in the project dependencies, the data layer only has a link to the domain layer. So the data layer doesn't know anything about the web layer. Just like the domain layer doesn't know anything about the data layer or the web layer. So there's no web or data here, but the web layer knows all about both data and domain. So the web layer has to know about all these things and has to be aware of all the interfaces in the domain, has to know all about all the implementations in the data layer, and has to know how to glue them together using IOC container and dependency injection and mapping and all that stuff. So those are the three main layers that you have in this project. We've got data or domain, data, and web. So then I'll go into some of the other projects that we have in here. So I already mentioned common. This is just where we needed a place to keep a few things that are shared between different layers. We at one point had some specs for the common, the things in the common layer. We may fill this back up with some specs for that. By the way, when you see specs, that is interchangeable with tests. It's just that in the BDD world, the behavior-driven design or development world, the word specs is used more commonly, specifications. So here you've got. Remember, I said that data, the repositories in the data layer are very hard to test with just unit tests. So you have to use integration tests. So here in the data specs.integration, we actually have some tests, some integration tests for the repositories in the data layer. So the name of this is important because when we run the tests in IOC, we run the integration tests separately or in a different way than we do the unit tests. Unit tests can be run without any kind of bootstrapping, any kind of setup. They just run. Integration tests often require a little bit more care at the startup. So it's important that if you're going to have integration specs, that you create a new project, keep them separate from the unit specs, and actually use this syntax, data or whatever .specs .integration. That way, that convention helps us to keep those things separate. As you'll notice here in the domain specs, things can be organized very, very similarly to how the domain layer itself is organized: commands, entities, services, things like that. And from there you can organize these however you'd like to. We are using mspec for our testing in the back end. Then you'll notice here there is WebCrud specs. WebCrud is a project that is helping us to access the same database that the web layer is using, but using more direct SQL and just CRUD operations that our acceptance tests can access while the API is running. When this is deployed to staging in production, WebCrud is actually completely removed from the solution. So it doesn't get built or deployed when it's in staging or production. Only when it's in a development environment are those two available, and are they built and compiled. So yes, that's super insecure. It's horrible. And you would never want that in a production system, and we certainly don't have it in a production system. The last one on the list here is the web specs, which is just again, it's a a project full of specifications for our web layer, and these specs typically are testing the query logic or just testing to make sure that things got dispatched the way they should have, that the command was created properly and things like that. So that is how our project is structured, and I hope this helps you to navigate your Glee project a little faster.